floating on its back like a carefree bather, is an animal that's lived through one of the most hazardous survival stories of any creature in the world. It's the Californian sea otter, which everyone thought had sunk without trace into the great ocean of animal extinction. And then quite recently it surfaced again off the Californian coast, close to the fishing port of Monterey. For me, the sea otter is not only one of the world's most fascinating creatures, but also one of the most endearing. You only have to watch it for a couple of minutes to see why so many people feel this way about it. It's a pretty good underwater swimmer, though nothing to compare with some other aquatic mammals, like whales and dolphins, or even seals and sea lions. It's more recently adapted to the marine environment. The sea otter's special talents and appeal are mostly in evidence when it's on the surface, grooming or feeding or just sleeping. Like an old moustached gentleman in a comfortable club armchair, it reclines on the Pacific swell, securely anchored by kelp, a kind of seaweed. It's one of the few tool-using animals on Earth. It uses stones to crack open its food. It's only able to do all these things while floating serenely on the ocean because it possesses the densest, richest, most water-resisting fur. This fur is what so nearly brought it to extinction. Sea otters once abounded from the Aleutian Islands to Mexico. In the north, the Aleuts and Indians had always hunted them for their fur with primitive weapons. Then the Russians discovered the northern sea otter population, and in just over 100 years killed 500,000 of them. To satisfy the demand for their fur among the nobility of Europe and the Far East. If the otters hadn't nearly died out, the Russians who'd started colonizing Alaska might well be there to this day. Back in the 1800s, the Russians started looking south to the Californian coast, where the Spanish had been trading for sea otter pelts with the Indians for 200 years. In 1812, the Russians got together with American traders and built Fort Ross, 240 miles north of San Francisco. The fort guards a bay where the Russian ships put ashore for supplies and landed the sea otters slaughtered along the coast nearby. Today, the 12-foot redwood stockades are carefully preserved by the Americans as the only Russian fortress in the New World. But by 1841, the Californian sea otter had been shot out and the Russians abandoned Fort Ross. By 1911, the sea otter had almost disappeared from its once vast range. In that year, the species at last got international protection. There were known to be a very few in the far north, but in the south, everyone was convinced the otter had gone for good. Then, in 1938, something very dramatic happened, just south of Monterey at Bixby Creek. The California Highway Department was at that time building a bridge across Bixby Creek to carry the new West Coast Highway. The construction gang soon noticed heads bobbing up and down in the surf. Previously, only a few naturalists had known that the Californian sea otter was struggling to make a comeback in this one area. Once the bridge builders had spotted it, the secret was out. There was only one thing to do. The California Fish and Game Department declared the offshore kelp beds a reserve. The Game Department soon realized that there were far more otters around Bixby Creek than anyone had imagined, about 100 all told. Now that the search had begun, otters started showing up in several more remote parts of the coastline. There were possibly as many as 300 along the whole California coast. Given proper protection, 300 sea otters seemed to have a very good chance of re-establishing the species. But then the war came, and no one had much time to worry about the otters. However, the first aerial count in 1957 picked out 638 animals in the kelp beds, which are their natural home. Kelp is a type of giant seaweed. Beneath the waving fronds at the surface, its stems sometimes reach down 100 feet to hold fast on the ocean bed. This kelp is the fastest growing plant in the world, adding 18 inches a day, which is faster even than tropical bamboo shoots. Underwater, the kelp forms a forest with groves and glades, patches of sunlight and submerged arboreal glooms, where the sea otter hunts and plays. But it isn't just a playground as far as the sea otter is concerned. It shelters a complicated submarine society with plentiful supplies of sea urchins at the bottom of the kelp ladder and the sea otters who feed on the urchins at the top. Of course, there are plenty of fish in the kelp beds too. Otters being what they are, you might expect that they'd make the most of this situation, but not a bit of it. Unlike their land-based cousins, sea otters hardly bother with fish. Crabs are a different matter. The kelp beds are full of small crabs as well as red starfish. The otters eat a great number of both. But neither of these members of the kelp bed community are anything like as popular with the otters as sea urchins and mollusks, especially one particular kind of mollusk. This is a large shellfish called the abalone. Unfortunately, it's also a favorite delicacy for the human species. At surface level, the kelp plays a vital part in the sea otter's life too. For one thing, the waving fronds of kelp provide a breakwater against the power and surge of the Pacific waves. Sea otters need such a haven for many reasons. Unlike the land otter, they very seldom go ashore. So when they groom their thick, luxuriant fur, they have to do so afloat. Obviously, it would be a serious disadvantage if they were being washed ashore all the time that they were doing their toilet. The shelter from the kelp prevents this. Sometimes, to make doubly sure of a safe anchorage, they wind the kelp around their bodies with a twisting movement. For a sea otter, grooming is much more than just a routine matter of toilet. The animal's very existence depends on doing the job regularly and thoroughly. Unlike seals and dolphins, the otter has no layer of blubber to keep it warm. Simply this superb, rich coat between flesh and ocean, the fur which so nearly caused the sea otter's extinction by hunting. The otter's body temperature is 101 degrees Fahrenheit. That of the Pacific Ocean around 50 degrees. If the cold water reached the skin, the otter would lose heat so quickly that it would soon die. So they continually comb and lick their inch-thick fur to keep it waterproof. When submerged, their coats appear silver from the trapped air they blow into the fur while grooming. An otter can stay submerged for up to 4 minutes. During much shorter dives, they've been known to collect as many as 7 sea urchins. They all seem to be right-handed when gathering food, usually storing it under the left armpit. Sea urchins sometimes get dropped. They're prickly things to hold. One of the otter's favourite foods, the abalone, is an even tougher proposition. It doesn't have defensive spines like the urchin, but it's anchored securely to the bottom by its sucker-like foot. This otter doesn't succeed in loosening his abalone at the first attempt. But otters are so fond of this shellfish that they'll make up to 20 dives to get one, and will even pick up a stone from the bottom and use it as a hammer. This action had never been seen before this film was taken. Back on the surface, the otter shows his most remarkable characteristic, being a tool-using animal. He rolls over to get rid of the large stone he'd balanced on his chest. The otter uses a stone anvil in this way to crack open clams, crabs, and other hard-shelled food. This ability to use a tool puts him in a small but extremely select company of creatures, which include the chimpanzee, the orangutan, the bowerbird, the woodpecker finch of Galapagos, and the Egyptian vulture, and, of course, man. This otter this time uses a flat stone, rather like a picnic table. It's cracked the shell on the stone, and now it's enjoying the soft flesh. This stone must be a favorite one. The otter made a fresh dive to bring up that sea urchin, during which time the stone, of course, sank to the bottom. But it retrieved it to continue its meal. To keep up its body warmth, the sea otter needs a great deal of food, about a quarter of its 45-pound body weight every day. That's another reason why the kelp beds are so essential to its survival. They're a rich larder stocked with all the high-protein food the otter needs. Strangely, in view of the hard-shelled nature of much of its food, the otter's sharp canine teeth don't seem to be used for tearing or holding its prey, but rather for winkling out the flesh inside. Sea otters seem to have few, if any, enemies. The gull is there in close attendance as a scavenger or hanger-on, hoping for scraps that fall from the otter's floating table. The relaxed position on the back allows the otter to use all its energy where it's most needed, in this case to crack a particularly tough nut, or rather tough shell. Otters will keep up this exhausting hammering process for minutes on end, occasionally stopping to see if the shell is cracked, so that they can go to work with their teeth. It would seem that the sea otter lives a carefree life, literally on the crest of the wave. But it's not quite as simple as that. The sea otters of the Californian coasts can deal with all natural perils. Winter storms and rough seas account for a few newborn young and sickly old otters. But the population continues to grow and spread. It's only when they come up against human opposition that the otters are in trouble. Fishing for that large succulent shellfish, the abalone, has become a growth industry along the Otter coast. The skin-diving fishermen claim that the numbers of these shellfish have sharply decreased since the otter returned and began to spread its range southward through the kelp beds. This is probably true, but what the abalone industry overlooks is the fact that the number of fishermen have also increased sharply, and the abalone is therefore being overexploited. The fishermen are only allowed to take shellfish of a certain size. A measuring device on the diver's knife checks each abalone for size. It's certainly one safeguard against depletion of future breeding stocks. This one's not up to minimum size and goes back onto the seabed. Well, that's a sensible piece of conservation, but this most certainly is not. Many of the fishermen purposely destroy sea urchins by spiking them with their knives. The reason they do this is that the urchins eat away the holdfasts that anchor the kelp forests. It's true that without the kelp beds, there'd be no abalones. What the fishermen ignore is that the otter feeds very largely on urchins anyway. If the urchins are killed off, then the otters are likely to eat more and more abalones. The otters will keep the numbers of urchins in check. In other words, it's quite possible to have sea otters, urchins, and abalones all living in a balanced kelp bed society in a way that could benefit the fishermen. The fishermen, who earn their living in a hard and sometimes dangerous way, are difficult to persuade that they and the otters can coexist. So little scientific work has been done on the ecology of the kelp beds that it's impossible at the moment to present the abalone trade with concrete facts. That task is up to the scientists. People are bound to intrude more and more on the sea otter's world. After all, the animal has chosen to make its comeback in a much-desired tourist area. But human sympathy and even curiosity can be used to help it. These furs shown to the children underline the dangers of overexploitation. Monterey is a busy fishing port, but the sea otters don't seem to appreciate the fact that these waters hold many hidden dangers for them. Fishing boats spill fuel and lubricating oil. Household detergents are harmful to the waterproofing of the otter's fur, and the otters swallow all these pollutants while grooming. The increasing number of high-speed pleasure boats present a threat, even when the otters are underwater. This raft of otters is untroubled by the speedboat's wash, but the boats often have a far more direct impact. A young otter has been struck on the back by a propeller. Sea otters are exceedingly trusting about human activities generally, a fact which in the past made them easy to kill. Though collisions with boats are becoming increasingly common, it would be an exaggeration to suggest that speedboats are a real threat to the sea otter. They're more of a symbol of the fact that modern man has got to watch his course as far as the sea otter's concerned. Wildlife workers take this young casualty away to treat his wounds. It's good that someone cares enough, so let's hope that he survives. At the moment, despite all the threats and dangers, the sea otter is still increasing. They can be seen rocking among the kelp beds in rafts, sometimes 70 strong. Males and females are usually in separate groups. The youngest kits, or pups, are with the females, to whom they are strongly attached during the early part of their lives. Pups are born in the sea and all the year round, though most arrive in early spring when there's less danger of rough seas separating them from their mothers. They're cradled by their mothers during those first weeks. They can't swim at all by themselves. The pups are as buoyant as corks. It takes them quite a long time to learn to swim on their backs like a grown-up otter. For a month or two, they're totally dependent on the mother ship as it forges through the kelp streamers. When she's had enough of him, she pushes him overboard. After all, she has to get food herself sometimes. All alone and rocked in the cradle of the deep, the baby otter remains secure in the snug nursery of the kelp until she returns for him. Eventually, of course, he'll have to learn to swim for himself, but for the moment he relies on her entirely as she drives herself powerfully along by means of her hind feet. One day soon he'll make his first clumsy swimming efforts, when his mother abandons him to dive for food. If she's away too long, he'll cry quite loudly until his mother finds him. She surfaces with a shellfish, but still finds room to take him on board. The gull doesn't worry her, but she's not going to allow an intruding male to come too close to her baby. When he's been sent about his business, she picks up Junior again. A week or so later, the baby has grown quite considerably. He's more active now as he feeds from the teats that lie between her hind legs. His mother grooms his fur a great deal. From now on, he's going to be less and less in contact with her and more in the water. Female sea otters produce a pup a year. Biologists estimate that the Californian otter population should increase by about 5% a year, provided food supplies and preservation of kelp beds can be reconciled with the fishing industry and other human pressures. Luckily, the sea otters have quite a lot of public support. The underwater otter feeder is a member of an organization called Friends of the Sea Otter. They were among the first people to sound the alarm when the abalone fishermen started complaining about the otter's damage to their industry. This body has done a most valuable job in bringing attention to the possibility that the species, once so nearly exterminated, may find itself in danger a second time. But in the end, squids and sympathy won't be enough. Publicity will have to be backed by solid scientific facts, which will assure the fishermen that they and this endearing creature can successfully live together.